Welcome to THRIVEpod, Lancashire's first podcast dedicated to discussion all about the local food system. I'm your host, Lorraine Wheeler, and joining me for this series is my co-host, Gina Somerville. THRIVEpod is part of the Food Futures Network, seeking a local food system which is healthy, resilient and fair. So welcome from Lancashire to wherever in the world you may be. Hello to the people and welcome to another edition of THRIVEpod. I'm your host, Lorraine Wheeler, and I'm joined by my co-host, Gina. How are you doing today, Gina?
I'm all right, thank you. I'm really looking forward to our guest today because I actually know our guest. We used to volunteer together at the Sling Library, and Beccy's actually been to my house before to help me with what to do with my vegetable patch in the back of my garden. And also she was interviewed by my kids during lockdown, during our homeschooling. We did some interviews with interesting people, and Beccy was actually our very first interview. And then that afternoon we went out and planted a whole bunch of seeds.
Well, Beccy certainly is a very interesting person. So, as Gina's alluded to today, our guest is Beccy Whittle. Beccy works for the university. I'm sure she'll tell you a little bit about that later on as we talk. But she also has a personal passion in growing food, and she's been very involved in a local community project in Scotch Quarry, which is in the neighbourhood near Williamson Park. And we're going to talk to her today about and talk generally about the subject of how can we grow more food. So welcome along, Beccy, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So I guess what's your journey then into growing food? Because you're on paper, you're a university lecturer. Is that right?
I am, yeah, exactly. I always feel like I wear like about a million hats. So, but yeah, that is my day job. But I guess how I got into growing food was kind of, I was lucky. So I grew up in Dorset in the south of England, and we didn't have a big house, but we did have quite a big chunk of garden with it, and it was quite traditional, I suppose. Like my dad grew a lot of veg, and he actually had this was back in the give away my age. I was born in 1979, so this would have been like early 80s when I was a kid growing up, and we actually had one of my dad's friends would come and also garden on a spare bit of land at the back of our garden, and he was like a traditional kind of allotment type guy. And we had these two massive, like really old, actually Bramley apple trees at the top of the garden. So I don't recall, it wasn't like I was super, you do get some kids, I think, who are like super into growing and super into plants. And I wasn't like that, but I just liked being outside. And I liked, I guess helping my dad with we'd always harvest the Bramley apples every year. And I have also like quite memories of him, like he'd pick off all the caterpillars off his brassicas and put them in a bucket of soapy water. Like that was always, a bit of a stretch. That's one of the memories that sticks out. I can't say I enjoyed that, but I just enjoyed being outside. So yeah, we had a lot of that. And then like a lot of people, I always cared about nature and the environment. So that was why I decided to study geography at uni, because like I had this really cheesy thing that I just wanted to help make the world a better place, which when I look back looks really naive and arrogant, but that was genuinely like my motivation. And I really cared about people and places, and I've always done, and I still do. But yeah, obviously then my uni learning was like much more like kind of theoretical. I was kind of like living away from home. And then like a lot of people, I was in a scenario where I was in a student flat for ages, small house, no access to garden. And then, when I met like Peter, who's now my husband, like our first rented house it just had a yard, and we didn't really have any opportunity to garden. So it was only basically when we actually bought our first house together, which did have like a really small and back garden, that suddenly it was like, I guess maybe it was that thing that, doing the gardening with my mum and dad as a kid, like, or just being out in the garden, it was a bit like a seed that had been planted that was kind of dormant for a long time. And then finally I had the opportunity, and we had this garden, and I'm like, how do I look after it? So I was kind of on the phone to my dad like every weekend going, what do I do about this? And around a similar time actually, I was really struggling quite a lot with my mental health, and a friend invited me to she didn't know this actually, but she was like, look, we've got an allotment, it's a bit too much for us, do you want to come and help out? And I was kind of a bit like, I don't know, was just an effort to do anything at the time, but I said yes, and I went along, and sometime every time I went there, I felt better, and I just loved it, and it kind of became really therapeutic because I could see where I'd been. I could kind of clear a patch of land, and I could plant things in it. And I've heard a lot of gardening writers since talk about how putting a seed in is like a massive act of hope, because you're kind of putting something in. It might be dark, it might be like the really early spring when it's cold and not nice, but you put that seed in, and you're kind of like, there's sort of somehow, well, there always was for me, like this belief that there'll be better days when the seed comes up, and then it's so satisfying, like watching that plant and like nurturing it through. So that was really how it started. And then you just like, as I say, it becomes a bit of a, for me, it was a bit of a positive feedback loop. It's like, oh, this makes me feel good. This is really nice. Yeah, obviously some things don't work, but I'm like, how can I tweak that? How can I do more? So we just, and yeah, Peter, my husband, he's really into it as well. So we bought more books. We kind of started learning. And then a community garden started next to our house, actually, which I think we'll talk about in a minute. But that was another sort of like spur to my learning, I guess.
So you're a self-taught gardener.
Yes.
Wow. And just from your introduction there's so much I could choose to sort of pull out and talk about. I mean, even the talk about mental health and the fact that there's just that thing about being outside and getting your hands in the soil. But that's so interesting that you had a garden when you were growing up that you actually shared with somebody else, as in you allowed them onto your space to grow their own food. That seems like such a almost brave and kind of outdated concept now, because obviously it's like an allotment mentality, but on your own or on your parents' own space. So, I mean, what a brilliant idea. Wouldn't it be wonderful if everybody shared their garden spaces that they're not using and allowed other people to come in and grow food? Perhaps we will see that in years to come. So your lecturing is in geography. So when I think of geography, I think of maps, and I think everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of people would probably, in a layman's term, think the same sort of thing. So how did you make that connection between geography and your passion for growing?
Yeah, I suck at maps, so don't give me one when I'm out on a walk, because I will just get us lost. It's a joke. It's a joke that I can't read a map. I can never get any of the geography questions in Trivial Pursuit. So yeah, I'm not that good at colouring.
You plastered your downstairs bathroom with them, haven't you?
I have, yeah. I do arty things with maps, but I'm not very good at orientating myself.
They're a craft activity. Exactly. Okay.
So yeah, funny enough, so the food connection with geography came later. So I've always been, like I say, I've always been interested in sustainability. So actually, no, that's not true, is it? Like my PhD was actually about the links between local food and tourism. So I was looking at the Lake District, and I was looking at Exmoor, and I was basically asking people, when you go on holiday to a place, do you want to eat food from that region, or do you want to go to McDonald's? That was like essentially the
wow.
That was essentially the focus of my PhD.
And what did they say?
A mixture. People did want local food. I think there was that, but there was also, obviously, there's a lot of factors to do with like convenience and cost, and like, oh, my kids might not like that thing that's like, they might not want to eat a, I was struggling to think of some random like Cumbrian or Exmoor ingredient that kids might reject, but that kind of thing.
It's possibly not always that easy to know where to go as well. I mean, unfortunately, you get a McDonald's on every roundabout, and it's a great big M, and everybody knows what it is. If you're going to a place, especially if you have, as you alluded to, younger children, it's spending time sort of digging around trying to find a nice local outlet that serves locally produced food. I imagine that's quite a kind of time drain as well. So it isn't always.
And I think it's super important not to be like, I totally don't want to be judgmental about that, because there are really good reasons that people do that, as you say, and like cost and
absolutely
like familiarity, and like just, when I did my PhD, I wasn't a mum. Now I am a mum. I know that like one of my interviewees actually said self-catering is no holiday for a woman, and I'm like, yeah, I can kind of see that actually. So
I was just thinking about that this morning, actually, because we're going away this weekend and we're staying in a self-catering thing, but I'm just hoping to eat out the whole time, because shopping in an unfamiliar place, cooking in an unfamiliar kitchen, which doesn't have, the herbs and spices, the pantry stuff that I'll have, the utensils and, whatever. It's just an added stress. Yeah. Like, I'd rather stay at home.
Exactly.
So, I think that, there's definitely, and I think maybe that kind of segues us into growing food as well. There are kind of practicalities, there's time issues, there's money issues. You know, we grew a lot of food during lockdown, but since then I've kind of been back at work, the kids have been at school all day, and our efforts have really fallen off. So, you know, how do we stay the course? Or I think a question that I wanted to ask as well is it important to grow even just a little? Is it helpful to the planet? Is it helpful to our society? Even if you can only manage something small, like to actually be self-sufficient, you need a farm. Like we have quite a bit of space at the back of our yard, and we grew different things, and it was lovely. We had a nice tomato crop or whatever, but it was definitely not food that could sustain our lives. So, you know, where to go and what's important?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And like, I guess I would absolutely say that, a bit like we were just saying, I really think that there's a risk that in this era, when obviously a lot of us are concerned about environment and climate and whatever, that this just becomes another stick to beat ourselves up about, like the fact that we don't do more of this. And as you just said, Gina, I think that it is super challenging. I mean, one of the things, and we might segue back to this later, but I feel like growing your own food, like, and yes, there are like lower maintenance ways that we can do that, and I can speak a bit about that in a minute, but on the whole it still does require like quite a bit of time and effort, and not everyone always has that, you know. Or yeah, maybe you're ill, like maybe life circumstances change, maybe like, I mean, our allotment used to, which was so interesting, which as I said was always my happy place. Like when my son, and when he was a baby and he still napped, I could totally do that. But when he stopped sleeping in the day, it became, to be honest, it became like a bit of it felt like a bit of a, sometimes felt like a bit of a chain to me, because I'm like, I don't have the time. Like when I'm not like actively working or doing childcare, I need to rest. Like I'm not like, it's not right next to a house either. So I actually, for a few years, like, and my husband did a lot of it as well, which was awesome. And he still would take himself down there, but I felt a little bit more disconnected from it. And it's only been like this last year when a lovely friend from work like let on that she was really wanting to get an allotment and get involved in growing. And she was like, "Could I come and help you on ours and on yours?" And that would be amazing, you know. And she has loved it, so doing it, and that has been an arrangement that works really well. We tend to go down every Friday lunchtime for a couple of hours, and we garden together, we put the world to rights, we like have that social connection like while we're doing it, and it's such a massive help.
I was going to say that kind of brings you full circle to where you were growing up, where your parents shared a bit of their land. You
Exactly.
know, obviously, allotment isn't technically something that you own; it's something that you rent. And unfortunately, I know there's a big waiting list at the moment for most allotments, although that shouldn't uh, put people off actually looking into that, because things change all the time, and people have different commitments, and you know, allotments do come up. I know there's a list of them on the Lancaster City Council website if you dig hard
Mm-hmm.
enough. No pun intended. Um, wow. So now you have an allotment that you share with a friend, which is brilliant. You've got food growing in your own garden, obviously, and Scotch Quarry. Can you tell us about that then? How did that come
Yeah, so
about?
Scotch Quarry, I can't claim any credit for starting it, but it was basically, this was sort of a similar time actually to when we got our first house, and we got involved in the allotment. Um, so we lived right next door to Scotch Quarry Park, which for people that, a lot of people don't know it actually, even people from Lancaster. So it's a small urban park that used to be a quarry, very near Williamson Park. And in 2011, so Transition City Lancaster had a project that was to establish what they called fruity corners across the city. So the idea was that a lot of the houses adjacent to Scotch Quarry don't have their own gardens, you know. And like I've said, I've, you know, now, and I'm especially aware of that. Like I look back at my childhood and I think, God, what a lot of privilege. Like, and a lot of people completely don't have access to land in the same way that I did growing up. So the reality is that a lot of people, yeah, just have a concrete yard or maybe no space at all. So Transitions project was all about how can they put forage gardens basically. So planting up different areas of public land adjacent to areas where people don't have gardens and stuff, that full of like foods, plants, but also plants that are really attractive to wildlife, with the idea that people can just come and forage, like, so they can just get herbs and a bit of fruit, and it creates a nice environment for wildlife. It creates a beautiful environment for people to sit. So we got a flyer through our door saying that one of these projects is starting in the park next to you, and it was looking for volunteers. And me and Peter thought, oh, we'll go along and have a look. Um, so yeah, it was really good, and we got involved in building the garden. And a wonderful person called Jennifer Laurel from Carpe Diem Gardens, who is like a professional permaculture designer and edible landscaper, she did a course that was all about teaching you how to grow your own. And she got us as a group of people to kind of, she taught us the skills to collectively design this garden. Um, so yeah, Jennifer's amazing. I would say she taught me like kind of 80% of what I know about plants and growing and gardening.
Wow.
And yeah, so Scotch Quarry started then, and we had a session, we planted it up, and it's now like 11 years old. And yeah, there's a few, we've made some mistakes, and it's definitely struggling a little bit with climate change now, I would say, because we're for people that don't know, again, we're planting effectively in very large containers because the land's contaminated. So it's like we've got trees and stuff like in raised beds. But yeah, it's still doing really well. And during COVID, actually, it stayed really resilient. Obviously, we weren't able to hold volunteer sessions and things, but the garden largely looked after itself. So that's another very different type of garden.
Perfect.
Yeah.
A garden that looks after itself. This sounds absolutely ideal, and I'm pretty sure that lends itself to one of the things that you're doing at Scotch Quarry in the coming weeks. Isn't that right? You're going to be doing a course helping people to look at what they can actually grow in their own space. And low maintenance is a phrase I want to hear. Can you want to talk a bit more about
Yes.
that?
So, exactly as Gina alluded to. So, there are lots of different ways in which people can grow their own food. And I realized actually, Gina, I never fully answered your question. So, like, does everyone have to grow food? I think no, not necessarily. But I would say what everyone does need to do is have some kind of connection with nature and an awareness of like that's what supports our food system. So actually responsible foraging can, even if that's just for a few blackberries with kids in the autumn, that is a really important practice. And it takes like virtually, you can combine it with doing a nice walk. It's not like an extra chore that you have to do. You can just eat them blackberries fresh there if you want, or you can put them in a pie or something, whatever you want. But that would be, I would say, step one is like start with an awareness of where food comes from and how abundant nature can be and where you can kind of access it for free would be step one. Then yeah, and we can talk about all different kinds of veg growing, but to segue back to Lorraine's question about like low maintenance gardening. So that's what Scotch Quarry is designed to be, a forest garden. So it's designed along permaculture principles. And there's a lot I could say there, but basically, and this is all the stuff that Jennifer taught us, but essentially it's based around permanent plants. So we have things like apple and pear trees, we have currants, red currants, black currants, we have herbs like oregano and chives. We also have some quite unusual plants actually, like Chilean guava and Szechuan pepper, which is a beautiful and very spiky plant. But yeah, all these things are like, the principle of it is that they're plants that they come back year after year. So essentially, if you get the planting right at the beginning and you work out what each plant needs, get it in the right place in relation to the other plants, like the system, yes, you'll always need to do a little bit of weeding because there are some species that will want to take over. You'll need to do a bit of pruning. We also add like compost and stuff every year because, like I say, we're in containers in this instance. But essentially, you've got a really healthy plant there, which is like going to come back every spring and fruit. It's not like annual veg, so things like tomatoes, lettuces, carrots. You have to every year. You've kind of got to clear the ground in some way, and you've got to put them in from scratch as a seed or as a plug plant in the spring. And you might get really like dodgy weather or something, that you might get a plague of slugs, you might get like late frost that will kill your plants, and they can grow really fast and get overwhelmed by weeds and need a lot of watering. So that can actually be that sort of gardening. I think there's some stat, Lorraine, you mentioned about allotments, and aren't they wonderful? And yes, they are to a degree, but I do think there's some stat that something like 90% of people who take on allotment give it up within the first year because it can be super hard work. Often also you inherit an allotment plot in not a great state. It might be covered in perennial weeds. Wait a couple of
Right.
weeks in summer and it's overwhelmed. So I think a lot of people, I'm mentioning this because a lot of people will have had the experience of trying to grow their own fruit or veg. Like it doesn't always work. You feel like a failure. You feel like it's something you did. But actually just to say that style of growing can be quite hard unless you're in like really good conditions, or you've got someone supporting you who knows, who's going to teach you like how to do it. You know, if you've got like a relative who can come and, but yeah, if you, a forest garden, like you get the design right at the start, and then it will, it's like nature's working on your side, if you see what I mean. It'll kind of like maintain itself to a large degree, and you just harvest it and look after it, and yeah, weed if
That
it's, if things
is
are taken over.
so interesting. I have to confess that I didn't really understand what permaculture was until I kind of heard you explaining it just now. And it really, I think, it's exciting to me because I kind of had that experience with growing veg that, you know, you have to start anew each time, which I found a little bit kind of almost a little tiny blow to my mental health. Like I've just felt a little bit like you're kind of on a treadmill, and also just, you know, I've got quite a bad slug problem in my garden, and like there were days where I kind of spent the day feeling quite upset because like my peas have been completely ravaged and destroyed.
Yep.
So I'm really, really interested in the idea that maybe you can work more in, because, you know, I didn't want to, like I have a cat, I have young children, and just in principle, I love feeding the birds, but I didn't want to spray a whole bunch of poison around, or, you know. So I'm really interested in maybe how you can work with nature rather than against nature.
It's about small and slow, isn't it? With permaculture, you know, it isn't about. I mean, I think we get this Mr. McGregor's garden kind of image when we think about allotments. At least I do, where somebody's going to go in and they're going to prepare all the soil. They're going to plant all the carrots. They're going to try and keep the rabbits away or the slugs. Then they're going to harvest them, and then they're going to put it to bed for the winter. And then, as you said, Gina, you're doing it all over again. You know, the next spring. But it's a perennial versus annual thing, isn't it? Really, but with food um, instead of flowers. So what do we grow? You've mentioned apples and pears, and obviously fruity corners lends itself to fruit, blackberries. Are there any easy to grow vegetables that grow well in this climate? Because this is another thing. We need to be very aware of the fact that where we're recording this, we're in the northwest of England, and you know, we have a very specific kind of climate. It's wet, it's windy, it's not the warmest. Are there certain kinds of seeds that work better here?
Yeah, there are some, like for sure, there are some sorts of veg that are like easier. So you can get some perennial veg as well. Like they're not, people don't always know about them, but there are some. For example, there's like, and this is the amazing thing about a community garden as well, is that people just come and like, and we've encouraged this, but people will come and add things. So there are things in that garden that we've never planted. Obviously, nature plants stuff all the time, but we had a few years ago, we had some brassicas appeared, and we thought they were like maybe purple sprouting broccoli or something like that, but they just like kept on growing and they got massive. And then we had the beast from the east, and they looked a little sad for a couple of days, but then they were just back again, whereas other things were like, you know, really not happy. And they are giant, and it's a perennial kale. So it's one of the most popular plants in the garden now, actually, for people to harvest. People that like kale, and it's quite funny actually, speaking about kids and food. So my son can be quite picky about veg, but the weird thing is he will gladly eat leaves off of that kale plant raw. If I cook them, doesn't want to know. But yeah, so kids like it as well. Some kids. The perennial kale is good. Chard, I would say, like Swiss chard is pretty easy, and it sows itself once it's going. What else? I mean, not strictly a perennial, well, not a perennial plant, but things like potatoes can actually, they are actually pretty easy to grow. Like you can grow them in a bucket or something, or like a big tub if you haven't got space, and they're quite satisfying because they don't need a lot of care, and they do taste really good if you've got like your own spuds. I'm trying to think of other easy veg.
My rhubarb, we planted it, and now it's very, you know, it bosses the other plants around.
Yeah.
Like the bed that it's in has been kind of taken by nature a little bit, but it's just fine.
Exactly.
Rhubarb is definitely a British boss when it comes to, you know, ease of growing. My parents even had rhubarb in the garden. and my dad went through phases of being good at growing, but the rhubarb was always there.
Rhubarb's brilliant, and it does really well in this climate. Like, I've got friends down south where it's hotter and drier, and it doesn't really like it there, but it likes the wet here. And yeah, like as you said, Gina, so it's a perennial plant. So the reason that your little annual plants have such a challenging life is because like each of those plants, like the only reserves they really have are like in that seed, and then they've kind of, just like any animal or plant, they're really vulnerable when they're tiny. So the slightest thing that goes off, whether that's some marauding slugs or a frost, or like, will really set them back. Whereas that perennial plant has got like a really well developed root system. Like, it might not have, like in the case of rhubarb, you might not see anything during the winter, but there's all that stored energy underground. And in spring, it's just got massive reserves, and it'll just go poof, and you just need to help.
It's
Yeah,
hardy.
exactly.
So, okay, so making this one of the things that we're really keen to do in the podcast, as well as across Food Futures, is making things accessible. So we're very aware, obviously, that there's an awful lot of people at the moment who are struggling more than perhaps they even were before. How do we, you talked about when you were a student and you had a yard and you didn't bother gardening for a while, and then you had a big bit of space and the interest came back. So how can we encourage people who perhaps don't have any obvious growing space? What would be the one thing? Like, how do they access the materials, and it doesn't cost much money? Other things we can repurpose that people might have at home? And what would you recommend would be the best thing to start growing where you can actually use the food? Would you say a tub of potatoes? Would you say a blackcurrant bush?
What you? Yeah. What I would probably say is like, yes, while anyone with a bit of creativity, anyone can grow stuff, and there's certainly things that are easier than others. So, for example, if you just have a yard, there are some really amazing examples of food gardens done in containers. There's a guy that a friend told me about the other day. So if you Google, I think vertical veg. So he's an expert in kind of. I've just bought his book actually and teaching people how to do that. So you can do that. But what I would probably recommend, going back to Gina's point about how some often trying to grow your own veg, if you're not experienced at it, if you don't have the space, if you're really time poor, and like it can, and you don't have that background, it can be really disheartening, and it can be quite labor intensive. So I would
Mm.
say find a community garden, find a friend or relative who would want a hand with their plots, because there will be so many people like I was going, I have an allotment, it's getting a bit much for me, like, and a well tended garden will be more productive, will be more than productive enough for like one person or household, right? So the more, if you have more help, you can often, and then you've got the social aspect as well. You've got someone on hand to show you how to do something. There's always someone to like ask for advice if things don't go right. You've got people to chat to while you're doing it. So
It's low risk and low investment as well, isn't
exactly.
it? If it's something that's nearby, I always think, if it's a rainy weekend or even a sort of cloudy weekend, and you don't particularly want to go and pay £10 to go to Jump Rush, or other trampoline parks are available, or a soft play, getting outside and getting involved in one of the community gardens, of which there are several. I think most of them are probably listed on the Food Futures website. There's Claver Hill as well if you're near the Ridge. I can't think of any others off the top of my head, but going down there with your kids and getting them out and about and getting their hands dirty, and having them weed their own patch and then see what they've done. Maybe it won't sustain their interest for as long, but it's
Yeah,
free, it's healthy, and it's teaching them something. And at the same time, as parents, or as grown-ups, we're learning from, as you say, from people who are there perhaps a little bit further down the line
absolutely.
than
Or hop
us.
along to, like you said, go along to a forage garden like Scotch Quarry. I mean, one of the really interesting things when we started that was people were going, what? So anyone can pick from it? You don't have to like have volunteered here to take stuff? And we're like, no, it's there for free. And I think in the West, because we have such strong notions of like private property and all of that, that can be a bit of a weird thought for people. It's more of like a commons mentality. But yeah, like I say, go and forage, like, and by all means, yeah, be respectful about how you do that. Obviously, like, leave plenty so the plant itself can sustain itself and for others. But there's a lot of free food out there that just doesn't get picked or used. Like, go take it, be thankful for the plant, like, and you can do that as part of a walk. You don't have to be like, I would just, yeah, really, I'd hate to think that anyone sort of starts gardening and then feels of it as like a chain, like a chain as in like, you know, weight around your neck. Or if you have money and no time, but you don't like, then you can by all means support by local food project, like for example like the plot is amazing, buy your veg from there, or single step, you know, like one of our amazing other local organic growers, like support them with your money if you have that money available.
If you
Yeah.
could do. We've got on the Food Futures website, and again we'll put this in the show notes, there is a local food directory. It would be good to have a look at that and see if there's anywhere near you that you're not aware of, that sells locally produced produce. That's a great sentence. And maybe in future years, where we all vacation in the UK, it would be brilliant if other towns and cities did that as well, so that if you were going somewhere, you could actually look online and see where the local cafes were, so that you had something to compete with that great big M on the roundabout. I wonder why we don't grow food anymore. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think most of us have stories of growing up and having our parents or grandparents growing things in the garden, and it does seem to be something that is. It feels like something of old, and yet it is something we absolutely need to start doing, isn't it?
Definitely. And I think it's something, yeah, like you were saying, when I think back to that, and obviously this is particular to my sort of like, I suppose, cultural history and stuff, but which will be different for other people. But if you think back to like when I was a kid, for example, growing up, and like I say, that friend of my dad's who used to share the plot. So these were all, they were like post-war generation. And my auntie, who's actually like a lot older than my dad, she was actually a land girl in the war. So she really, in fact, she was one of, I always feel like she's a bit of a mentor for me. She always like really encouraged me in the allotment and stuff, because she was, you know, she loved growing, and she used to drive the tractors, and she would like, yeah, do all that heavy work on the farm. So I think obviously that generation had that experience of scarcity during the war, and everyone sort of like grew some food at that point if they had like land available. But I think, you know, I'm constantly struck by like, at work I meet colleagues, for example, from Spain, and a lot of the time over there it feels like even like young people in cities, there's often a tradition of they'll have like a family like small holding or something in the countryside, and the grandparents will still cultivate stuff, and they'll go back to that regularly. So I think a lot of it has been, like you say, people don't have access to land. I think a lot of it is about people being time poor and cash poor as well, which keeps you time poor because you're always working to try and get money, and that doesn't leave a lot of time for like for yeah, sustaining ourselves, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I think gardening has become it's so much more than just the kind of monoculture of keeping a lovely lawn, isn't it? And it's about being a little bit messy and not necessarily having those neat rows of carrots like Mr. McGregor.
I can tell you about my $1 million aubergine if you
Oh
like.
yeah, let's hear about your $1 million aubergine.
So when I was in my, growing veg phase, I bought a lady, like one of my neighbours was selling aubergine plants. So I bought the aubergine plant for £5. I put it in the greenhouse, and because my greenhouse is on concrete, like you have to be really diligent about ventilating it and watering it and everything. It was up and down every day to the greenhouse, flowers, and then I made sure I took it out so that the bees could get on it and pollinate, and blah blah blah, and we've got special fertilizer for it, and lavished care and attention on this aubergine plant, and it grew one aubergine. And I was very happy. The aubergine was beautiful, etc. But as a kind of experiment in growing food, a lot of money and time has gone on to this plant. And I was doing it, in a hobby way.
Yeah.
And we were still homeschooling, and the kids were, So I feel like it was worth it because it was, an entertainment activity I had chosen to do. But in terms of either sustaining yourself or sustaining the planet, I don't feel like it was a great exercise, because the water, I do harvest rainwater, but the water and everything, the fertilizer and everything kind of just that went into making this one aubergine, like literally the world would collapse if everyone was putting that kind of effort into the kind of the calories of one aubergine.
Absolutely.
So
but every now and again, as you say, Gina, it's fun, isn't it? It can be totally fun, and we still do that. Sometimes on the I mean, on our allotment now, like on the whole, we've settled into, I suppose, like a sort of routine of the kind of things that we know grow well and that we like to eat as well. Because that's another thing actually that people don't always connect, is that for years you'd get
what do you want to
you know,
eat?
runner beans, for example, was an allotment staple. And there was someone else down the plot, and he would always give it, and I'd be like, "Why are you growing runner beans? Because you don't even like to eat them." But you know, he's like, "But I should grow them." You know, there's that thing. So you
Oh
grow
my
what you like
goodness,
to eat.
yes.
And actually, I think, you know, I'm joking, but that's actually, I do think that's important, because I think that, and this is a sort of little challenge that I want to set myself this autumn, because I've got a bit better at foraging, but I'm still not that confident, and there's a lot of things that I don't know. And I think that, you know, when I started, it's interesting, when I started gardening properly, my cooking also changed, because I'd be like, help, I've got a glut of this. Like, I'm bored of just like, I mean, courgette's the classic, isn't it? Like, I'm bored of like just roasted courgette. Like, what else can I do with it? You know, so then you start because you don't want to waste what you've grown. So I think
Exactly.
cooking,
Because you put more effort into it than just walking into the
yeah,
shop. And I think that is another reason why we grow less now, is just simply the availability and the cheapness. We've got year-round access to anything we want because it's just available there, wrapped in plastic for the most part, in the supermarkets, and even in the corner
yeah,
shops. But obviously, we know that isn't the best and most sustainable way to eat our food. One of the things I know we're looking at, which we won't discuss today, is about a North Lancashire diet and what it actually looks like to eat according to a seasonal calendar. Because actually, food tastes better when it's
yeah,
fresher and more local, and it tastes better when you eat it at the time of year when it's supposed to be ready for you to eat. So there's a lot of work to do around that, and making that accessible and making that affordable, and teaching ourselves what that even means, because we don't need to follow a seasonal diet, but perhaps that's a more sustainable way to eat. There's other things we've touched on today, like composting, which is a big topic. It doesn't seem like a big topic, but actually composting is really important, which we'll cover in other episodes as well. And like I said, the issue of mental health and well-being and just getting outside. I would add just something about foraging. Be really, really careful if foraging is something you're going to go and do. Make sure you know what you're picking. Maybe go with somebody that has foraged that particular thing before. I had to learn very quickly what elderberries look like and what masquerades as elderberries, so that I made sure that I was actually picking elderberries. And they're actually a lot of fun. You can just scrape them off the stem with a fork and boil them up, and they're actually quite nice if you add a sweetener. But yeah, just making sure that you're picking the right thing and not, potentially poisoning yourself or your dog or your friends, would be helpful. So we'll try and put a link in about that as well. This has been brilliant. This has flowed really nicely, and we've learned a lot and hopefully been encouraged. If people want to find out more about the course or any other programs you might be running, how would they do that?
great. So probably, I mean, I can give you a more accurate link for the show notes, but I guess
Brilliant.
in a verbal summary, people could go to the Scotch Quarry Facebook page. So if you go, it's just facebook.com/Scotch Quarry Park. If you scroll through some posts there, you'll see links to more information on how you can book. But it's a rolling, I should mention, it's a rolling program. So it's going to be monthly, but people can join at any point of time in the year. There is a small charge for it because we're trying to raise money to renovate the play park in the corner of Scotch Quarry, which is very derelict. And interestingly, as well as doing the play equipment, we are going to put some edible landscaping into the play park so you can snack while you're playing. So, and a wildflower meadow outside. So all the money from the course will go towards that. Yeah, we still need to find a little bit more, but yeah, there's different payment options. And if we don't want also money to be a reason that people can't participate. So if someone is listening and they think, I want to do that, but I don't have money, please just get in touch with me, and I'll give my details as well for the show notes, and we can sort something out. We can do like a skill swap or something else, because we just want this to be, it's a gift that we want to be able to give to everyone ultimately that would like it.
Shared learning. Fantastic. Very, very quickly, edible landscape. We've talked about that a couple of times. What would you describe that as?
Okay, edible landscape.
A landscape you can eat would be obvious.
A landscape you could eat, but also one that looks attractive. So again, if we think back to giving away my age, people that used to watch The Good Life, for example, like one of the running jokes in that, wasn't it, was that Margot next door was really unhappy because she thought it was going to look hideous. And yeah, they ploughed up the front lawn and there was pigs and like, it wasn't very aesthetic. But an edible landscape is the art, I would say, which is like that people, like I say, from Jennifer from Carpe Diem are really good at, of like, let's make a landscape we can eat, and it's lovely for wildlife, but it also looks beautiful. You wouldn't be ashamed to have that in suburbia.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, and thanks, Gina, as always, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you for joining us on this THRIVEpod. We've been Lorraine and Gina, and we invite you to join the conversation on social media at foodfutures.northlancashire using the hashtag THRIVEpod. Don't forget to check out the show notes for all the links you need. This podcast was produced for Food Futures by Amy Cole and was edited by Amy Cole and Lorraine Wheeler. Music by SimonTaylorMusic.com.